Well, welcome to this episode of the Dry Eye and Ocular Surface Disease section of the Clinical Podcast Series, brought to you by the American Academy of Optometry Foundation. Today's episode is Body Mass Index, Diet, and Outdoor Activity linked with Meibomian gland abnormalities in children. My name is Kaleb Abbott. I'm an optometrist and assistant professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, and I'm joined by Dr. Lindsay Six, who is an associate professor at the Illinois College of Optometry and residency coordinator for cornea/contact lens and ocular disease. And it's an absolute honor to have her join the podcast today. So thank you for being here, Lindsay.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're discussing a growing topic of interest, dry eye in the pediatric population. Why do you think that this topic has received so much attention lately?
Yeah, great question. Thanks so much for having me and recognizing our paper. I just want to highlight real quick that this paper was written with the assistance of a student who is a new graduate. So I'm very proud of Dr. Manisha Parikh. But, dry eye is more of a concern for everyone. Our clinical population is on digital devices more. They're more aware of dry eye, whether it's because of advertising for new dry eye therapeutics, or just because of the growing market for artificial tears and over-the-counter therapies. And with our digital device use increasing, so has our concern over dryness. And with pediatric patients, they might be using digital devices just as much as adults are. So they might not, they might have the same symptoms, but they also might not be able to express their symptoms. They might not know what they're experiencing. So they also have many more years ahead where they need their ocular surface to function optimally. And so we need their tear film to be robust, their meibomian glands to be functioning so that they can continue on in this digital world.
Yeah, well said. So what is the purpose of this study that you conducted?
This study, we aimed to characterize the meibomian gland architecture. So for that, we characterized meibomian gland morphology or abnormalities as both atrophy and tortuosity, and we graded them separately. And the goal was to take that and identify risk factors for dry eye in the pediatric population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for us to better understand dry eye in this population, we didn't understand what's actually driving that meibomian gland dysfunction. So really, really neat. How was this study conducted?
So we conducted this study at the Illinois Eye Institute, which is the clinical arm of Illinois College of Optometry. So we're in an urban center on the south side of Chicago. We brought 160 children into the study. They were primarily African American and Hispanic. And they were aged 8 to under 15, under 18. So we wanted a pediatric population under 18. We had them undergo a comprehensive eye exam, including slit lamp. We looked at their meibomian glands. We assessed their conjunctiva. We looked at their tear film. And then we brought them to the keratograph and did infrared meibomian gland imaging with the meibographer. We also did a non-invasive tear film breakup time. We measured their tear meniscus height. And then following the imaging, we assessed the images for the level of meibomian gland atrophy and tortuosity in both lids. We also administered to the participants a modified ocular surface disease index questionnaire. For kids, you might be asking why it's modified. Kids don't typically use bank machines or drive cars. So we moved those questions out and we asked a substitute question about digital devices instead. And then we also asked them about their screen time, their diet, mainly looking at whether they ate fast food and how often, and sugary beverage intake. And then we asked about their level of outdoor activity, both during the week and on the weekend. So we collected a lot of data and we were able to distill that down. And by some fancy statistics, linear multiple regression, we were able to look at risk factors for the meibomian gland changes that we saw.
Okay. And what did the study end up finding?
On average, we're looking at kids that were somewhere between about 8 and 14. In general, we found a level of meibomian gland atrophy that we qualified as severe, which is a score of greater than or equal to 2 in about a third of participants in at least one eyelid. We found tortuosity greater than or equal to 2 in 84% of participants in at least one eyelid. So tortuosity was more commonly found than atrophy, which makes you kind of think, what does one lead to the other? And we also found a medium symptom score of about 10, but the range was quite large. We had some participants that had a score of 0 for symptoms, and we had some, the highest I think was 71, which on your OSDI index, that's quite severe. So the amount of children that were in the severe category was about almost 13% had severe symptoms. We found that was quite interesting as well. Are we missing these kids? Are we even asking them the right questions?
Yeah.
So when we broke down the risk factors that we identified out of all the things we looked at was elevated BMI, body mass index. We found reduced outdoor activity was a risk factor, and then that unhealthy diet was a risk factor. And they were kind of associated with different pieces of what we looked at in terms of gland breakdown, but screen time, symptom score, age, gender, and race and ethnicity, none of those were associated with abnormalities. So I know we tend to think screen time can be associated, but our study did not bear that out.
Yeah, I think most people would be surprised by that. When we think about meibomian gland dropout in children, I think most of us would think that would be associated with screen time, but this study didn't show that. So that's pretty interesting. So this study found that nearly 1/3 of children have severe meibomian gland dropout in at least one eyelid, and that seems quite alarming to myself and probably to a lot of other clinicians out there. Why do you think that there's such a high rate of meibomian gland dropout in children? And do you think that maybe there's always been this rate of meibomian gland dropout, but we just couldn't detect it until now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point about detection, right? We used infrared imaging in this study, which hasn't been available, certainly isn't available to every single practitioner in every office, and might not even be being performed on children. It might be something that your practice reserves for adults or patients who are symptomatic. So, perhaps it has been there and we're just not imaging it if we don't have access to it, and perhaps we're not imaging pediatric patients if we're not thinking of it. So our study really suggests that a more thorough evaluation of dry eye and meibomian glands in general could be beneficial for children. I think it's also interesting to think about the instrument that we used. Infrared imaging is only a certain wavelength, and so I think there's some thought could longer wavelengths potentially image deeper into the glands and give us a different view of what's happening. So it would be interesting to repeat the study with like an OCT type imaging of meibomian glands as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think about. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on the meibomian gland tortuosity. So in your study, 84% of children had severe meibomian gland tortuosity, which also seems quite alarming. And in prior studies, this has been associated with higher BMI. Can you explain the significance of meibomian gland tortuosity and your thoughts about that finding?
Yeah, so meibomian gland tortuosity is essentially how crooked or bent are the glands. Atrophy would be the gland is not there or not visible on your imaging. So previous studies that have looked at meibomian gland architecture in relation to BMI have suggested kind of in their conclusions that meibomian gland tortuosity might be a precursor to gland atrophy. So if you look at, our patient population had a significant amount of tortuosity, less atrophy. So is it possible that our younger patients maybe are showing signs of tortuosity and that may eventually lead to greater levels of atrophy? I don't think we know right now. The mechanism for this is kind of unclear at this time. We really need more analysis to uncover the etiology for the meibomian gland morphology changes in children and their connection to BMI. So I think there's also another study, I think it's FAAO, that looked at the systemic lipid profile of patients with higher BMI. So it's possible that this systemic lipid profile could affect the meibom lipid concentration, affect the viscosity of the meibom, and therefore affect gland obstruction and gland morphology. So it'd be interesting to look at all of those things.
Yeah, I like that was included in your study. It's just another thing for us practitioners to start to think about, especially those of us that have meibographers and can be evaluating these glands, to be documenting things like tortuosity as well. Any relevant take-home points for our listeners, or any closing thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I think I would just close with two things. One is I would use caution in extrapolating what we find in our pediatric population to the general adult population. Again, we modified the OSDI. We don't have validated cutoffs for a lot of these tests in children. So this is definitely an area for future study that we're interested in at ICO. And then, we should just be more diligent about asking our pediatric patients what they're experiencing and maybe being more active or playing a more active role in screening them for dry eye, instilling that fluorescein, looking at the glands, doing imaging if you have that capability, just to kind of keep track of these kiddos over time so that they don't develop dry eye. And if they do, that we can treat them sooner.
Yeah, well said. Well, special thanks to Dr. Six for joining us today on the Clinical Podcast Series, and we'll see you at the next episode. Thank you.